eyes open with matchsticks.
Oh, not a problem. Not a problem at all. You recused yourself from the situation, did you not?
Yes, indeed.
Bedelia, what are you doing? My God. I mean, it's brilliant. Don't get me wrong. It's so in keeping with the nature and the tone of Hannibal, and that character in particular. She's such a verbose character, isn't she? I recuse myself from the situation. I love it. I love it to
Although
bits.
the vocabulary is incredible, isn't it?
And I love the fact that Crawford's immediate reaction is not what.
No.
What does that mean?
Yeah, that is a bizarre encounter, isn't it? And
Isn't it?
I mean, he actually says she says, I hope you understand. And he says, I don't. I really don't understand.
Well, she's giving loads of weird cues there, isn't she? She's almost like she's playing this really weird. Bedelia in these 2 episodes is really strange because she's playing this odd game where it's odd to know what her motivations are or what she's trying to do.
Well, it seems to me she's, kind of unique in this show. It's certainly at this point because she recognizes danger.
She does.
She works to remove herself from it in a way that the others can't. I mean, they all seem to be either being drawn in or actually choosing to dig deeper. I think she goes about it in the most extraordinary way, but
very strange way.
But
yes.
at the same time, it's like, oh, at last someone's gone. Do you know what? I think I'm just gonna remove myself from the menu.
But she goes to his house.
She goes to him and puts herself in danger. That's
right. She goes directly to his
thing.
house. I mean, this actually works in context with what we learn about Bedelia much, much later on. She's a very strange character. Her psychology is really
logic, I think. But it seems strange at this
danger,
point.
Isn't she? She's aroused and she is actually. I mean, Will has this very sarcastic line to her in the 3rd season. Where, I mean, Will is hateful to her in the 3rd season. He says to her, "What, you want us to believe that you lost yourself in the hot darkness of Hannibal's mind? Is that what it is?" And it's kind of true. She does want that.
From Will, though, that's...
I know, right? Complete hypocrisy. And what I love is the show knows it. The reason he's so hostile to Bedelia later on, and he really is because he's jealous. It's the jealous lover. It's the jealous ex. He wants to be in.
She puts herself into 2 moments of danger, not only by going to Hannibal, but also by going to Will at the end and saying what she does to him, crossing the white line. She's a danger junkie at the same time as trying to remove herself from danger. But as far as she's concerned, as far as anyone's concerned at the moment, Will really is in there for good reason. She doesn't know. I think she has her suspicions, but.
It's a weirdly, because it could be interpreted as a kind act. It could be saying to him, "I believe you." But actually,
Bedelia, I don't think it is at all.
Not really Gillian Anderson's choice, is it?
It's not. No. It's not in its effect, is it? In its effect, it's a very cruel thing to do. It's like dangling a hope and then taking it away.
Exactly that. And I think
she's doing it for some sort of reason of her own. She has to.
She's just fascinated. She can't help herself. She's got a little bit of Hannibal in her in that regard.
Well, she is. She is as a kind of doppelganger to him anyway, and indeed as Will is becoming. But they are distorted doppelgangers.
Exactly. I mean, these 2 episodes are all about this because she's not just a doppelganger of Will and of Hannibal, but she's also a doppelganger of Clarice Starling. And that sequence is, again, it's a mirror of the sequences between Hannibal and Clarice in the film.
The crossing of the line, they're going
exactly.
to. I mean, it's not Lecter, but it's Will Graham.
No, but it kind of is because it's this version of Will, right? Course, Will in these 2 episodes is
because he's a doppelganger.
He is. I mean, we're getting this again, all of this wonderful cross pollination where the characters are reflecting one another psychologically, but also in a very sort of existential way. Will is becoming a version of Hannibal.
But this hits on something that I think we've said in previous episodes.
Doppelgangers of doppelgangers.
Yes, it's a hall of mirrors, isn't it? A hall of distorting mirrors. But it's this thing about getting into the text, a text that we all know through various iterations, and repeating it, reflecting it, setting up mirrors, and getting inside it and changing it. We've all said at one point that there are texts out there, that even texts we love, that we would just really so much like to get inside and just move around. And in a sense, this is what Brian Fuller is doing. He clearly, I mean, I don't know enough of his history with Hannibal prior to the series. I don't know whether he had a passion for Thomas Harris's work or whether this just came across his bow and he was like, and he engaged with it as a professional should. But he basically, with his team and those writers, do get into that text, and that's why, actually, I know I'm jumping ahead slightly, but the part of the entire run that most worried me was the Francis Dolarhyde, because I've sort of seen this and read this too many times, and yet they still find ways to scramble it, invert it, pull it round. And that's the exciting bit with
that is the exciting thing, isn't it? And I think it's the fact that when it occurs, putting it at the end, which is a stroke of genius, rather than at the beginning,
would it make more sense in terms of ratings to put it
right, wouldn't it? But it mirrors all of the stuff that comes up before, because the Francis Dolarhyde story has actually occurred in its own peculiar way already. Because it does occur in the first episode. You have an echo of it there.
Yeah.
And then you have minor echoes of it all the way through, just as you have echoes of Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs and the other characters. It's the way this series works. These episodes, again, you've got like fractures of Clarice Starling everywhere, even though she's not like as a whole character in this show. Beverly Katz, right? Beverly Katz is mirroring Miriam Lass, who was a version of Clarice Starling, and now Katz is becoming the new Miriam Lass and a version of Clarice Starling as well.
Yes,
by going to Will and
it's not just distorting mirrors, is it? They're shards of mirrored glass. And in fact, that's what happens to Beverly. I seem to recall that she gets basically Damien Hirsted.
So much of that impulse that we feel to get inside the texts that we love, and so much of the time I think we're talking about franchises effectively, is the desire that that's sort of inculcated inside us to put things right, make things make sense, etc., etc. Particularly in fan culture, there's that desire for everything to join up perfectly, that gets the desire for a sort of verisimilitude that gets expressed in things like an obsession with canon and continuity and stuff like that. And that's kind of where the impulse starts for a lot of us, I think. Speaking as a fan, I mean, I fess up to this myself, and it's this sort of impulse towards an aggressive totalizing rationality that capitalist media culture kind of trains into us. And the great thing about this, as an example of a text or a corpus of texts, or even a franchise actually, that is being penetrated and moved around and reorganized inside, is that it's not being rationalized. It's being made more, I would say, very, very much so. It's being made more artistically satisfying by doing the opposite with it, by making it make less linear sense, by making it seem less, at least superficially, much less rational than the previous versions of this have been.
And in fact, there was a sort
it works so beautifully as well.
Inverted logic to this, because I just happened about a week ago to reread André Gide's The Counterfeiters. Now, that's an example of obviously French modernism, but the great thing about that novel is Gide had a story which he doesn't fully put in the novel, because he uses his role as narrator and to get inside and start scrambling his own text. The only difference there is we don't know what that full text is, and of course it's very possible that I don't really know too much on the background of how of him in terms of writing it, but it could be very much the case that he didn't know the full story of this text. So it was kind of apropos that last week I was reading something about getting inside a text and trying to make sense of how it worked, and of course it's slipping away from him, which of course is a deliberate device in his case. He's doing that purposefully as a writer in a new what was, it seems odd to say a new tradition, but you know what I mean. And to be watching Hannibal and going, well, this is, there is a lineage here in a way. This idea of getting in and setting up mirrors, distorting mirrors, and cracking a plot or a narrative that you've got rewiring it. I'm mixing metaphors all over the place, but then so are these guys. That's what they're doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's creating in some ways a dysfunctional text, because suddenly because it's exploding in all sorts of directions. It is, as Jack says, it's making less sense, but in its making of less sense, it's leading us down these cloisters, into this labyrinth, and therefore it becomes a much more potent thing. Suddenly Hannibal feels, as a series and as a text, feels really big. It's starting to feel really big at the moment.
Yeah. It feels resonant, doesn't it? As a result, it's not just a story. It's not just a narrative that's going from point A to point B to point C. There's something else going on here.
It's evolving in all directions, isn't it? I mean, it is like a web now.
It's also a huge thing in the Gothic. I mean, three of the huge hegemonic Gothic texts, Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's very much not called The Strange Case. It's called Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I learned this recently because I'm rereading it for the umpteen millionth time, because I treated myself to the Norton Critical Edition. And one of the things that I've learned from that, very interestingly, is that, this is a total byway, but you'll have to forgive me geeking out. Despite the fact that you will find millions of copies of it all over the world that have The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on the cover, that's not what it's called. Stevenson called it Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because he wanted it to sound like a newspaper headline. And if you go through the book, loads of the chapter subheadings have the same feel about them. The first chapter is not called The Story of the Door; it's called Story of the Door. But yeah, the point I was making was that Jekyll and Hyde, Frankenstein, and Dracula are all compilations of texts. They are, and in Dracula particular, I mean, the point in all of those is to create the uncertainty that the reader is being asked to contemplate, not necessarily to reconcile, but although that's the impulse that you inevitably have. But but particularly in Dracula, and we've mentioned Dracula many times in connection with this show.
Absolutely.
The characters themselves are conscious of the need to try to get inside their own corpus of documents and make them match up and make them make sense. And what they end up by doing that is actually something that at the end of the day is just this pile of, Mina actually says at the end, we rationalized all our documents to the point where all we ended up with is a load of typewritten pages that somebody could have just made up. So it makes it less rational by trying to rationalize it.
One of the things I like about that new piece of information, well, it's certainly a new piece of information for me, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, of course, it's one of the things about this, as you said, this hegemonic work of Gothic fiction that everybody knows, even if they haven't actually sat and read the text, everyone knows it or of it or has seen an adaptation of it or whatever. And it's not even that part of the title that is slippery. His name is slippery because we know it's really Dr. Jekyll. It should be, but it's become it has now become known as. I mean, you would say. In fact, curiously, because it would now sound so odd. I think if there were, a film adaptation or a theatre adaptation, and the decision was made, we'll call him Dr. Jekyll. I think people would be just so taken out at the moment. And yet, of all the adaptations I've ever seen, curiously, the only time I can recall an actor obviously making a decision by himself to be very insistent on the actual pronunciation of the name was in a parody of it, which is back when Bud Abbott and Lou Costello were making all the sort of monster movie comedies, because obviously Universal horror was it was in decline. So to try and revive the fortunes of things like Dracula and Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster and all that, they were making them into comedy films. And they do one where they are in Victorian London. They've been transplanted back to Victorian London, playing bobbies, but they're on secondment from America, the New York police force. And Brilliant. There's one actor in it who insists on calling Dr. Jekyll Dr. Jekyll, but he's the only one. And the director hasn't tidied this up and said, hang on a moment, we're going to have to make a decision here. It's just this one actor who plays a newspaperman in London who's got quite a big part in the film, and he just no matter how many times we hear the name Jekyll, he will always pronounce it Jekyll. It's just like, whoa, that's the only time I've ever seen this.
There is a lovely audiobook where Ian Holm reads the book and he pronounces it Jekyll. That's the only other instance I can think of, because I have all the different recordings of the audiobook. But yeah, it's another. These are all, the other thing I was going to say to join this up is that these are all texts that in their many, many, many adaptations, the various adapters have tried to do this thing where they get inside the text and make it, quote, make sense.
Yeah.
You know, in the way that they at the time of the adaptation have conceived of it making sense. So like famously in Jekyll and Hyde, the thing they always do is they have to actually pin down who and what Mr. Hyde is, what he looks like, what, you know, how he behaves. They give Jekyll a girlfriend. It's always a sort of sex fiend Jack the Ripper stroke ape man sort of thing.
Yeah.
Most of the time anyway. But that's Hyde makes a lot less quote sense than that in the original text.
Absolutely, it does.
These adaptations are all attempts to do that. Hannibal is doing something similar, but as I say, it's doing something anti-rational, or at least as rationality is, you know, defined in the culture industries, and certainly in the sort of fan consumption
by, you know,
mindset.
I mean, but I think it's exacerbated at this point as well, because I mean, although I think we've grown used to the fact that in this version of the Hannibal text, the fuller version, I hate going auteur on this, but it's just a shorthand. But everyone speaks, of course, in a very stylized vocabulary. It's heavily and deliberately symbolic. Most of its information is carried by looks and reactions, or through non-verbal stuff, the mise en scène, the music, the edit composition. My God, you know. But the other thing, of course, it's done, as we've remarked on, towards the end of series 1, is now even the content has disengaged from the very formula that provided it with a possible hook that we used to, as we joked, CSI Baltimore. But that then just takes us right back to the point you were making, George, that even the placement of the Dollarhide story, you know, it would make much more sense in purely practical terms, in terms of thinking about ratings and hooking in audiences, to put that in an entirely different place in this narrative.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think, you know, ultimately, it is an artistic project. I think there's a real passion here, which is rare in this kind of television, in this kind of series. And they really did want to do something with this. They wanted to do something which is now crystallizing in season 2, right?
It's
season 1, obviously,
losing viewing figures every season, and there is a sense that that's not its. It's almost like this is a bunch of people who have worked within the parameters of network television. I mean, Fuller himself has a pedigree even before Hannibal, and all the people who are attached to it have worked. You know, there's a lot of experience there. I mean, the director of this one, obviously, is the director of The Changeling, which we covered in Spook Time. I mean, you know, we're talking, you know, by this point now, a very senior director, an older director, and yet everyone seems to be kind of in on the conceit that it's
at this point,
this isn't going to
and they don't care. What I love is they don't care anymore. Like in season 1, it is still an experiment. You know, they're still trying to garner an audience. They're trying to gain some measure of stability with a format that's recognizable. And that season 1 is often straining against that. You know, season 2 does not care.
Is that to pull this off in the last 25 years, say, or 20 years, that's because now everything is in the television industry and in popular culture is so locked down. It's
so codified, right?
Yeah, I mean, to have something slip through like this.
Yeah,
I mean, we can only, in a sense, put it in.
The
easiest way to put it for us is British terms, because we're used to British television. But back, obviously, up into the 90s, where you had formats which would allow things to appear in that couldn't appear anywhere else. And of course, over time, as things were neoliberalized or gentrified, those things like Screen 1, Screen 2 was shut down. Play for Today was shut down. The head of series and serial, or the department for series and serials, just became the department for drama. Everything is now about, as you say, codifying, simmering down, making less complex, much easier to pull in ratings or whatever. I don't know what the American equivalent of that necessarily is. I know they have things like PBS and HBO and so on, but the fact that this show could even exist at all by this point, you'd be not surprised to think, oh, they'll do 2 seasons of this, then they'll be out.
Let alone to exist in the shape that it does, right? With this material, I mean, the obvious thing to do would be to make it like Dexter or something like that. Something very literal.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's going to be, I mean, I think it already is, but I think certainly in another 25 years' time, it's going to be a very strange relic of early 21st century telly. I don't think that people are going to be able to understand it at all, or how it happened.
Well, it requires exegesis, doesn't it? That's the weird thing about this show. It requires this. It requires people sitting down and talking about it to rake through it, because it is like someone's subconscious, isn't it, this show? It's strange images and concepts and things flying around, and contradictions and ambiguities and strange flights of fancy. I mean, in this episode in Sakizuke, we have the Eye of God, this strange mural made out of dead bodies, which is simultaneously moribund and macabre and exquisite. Absolutely exquisite.
This is a show that demands to be read. It demands that it just says to you, you can't just watch me. No. You can't just watch me. I mean, you can, but what you're supposed to be doing, you can, but you're not going to get much out of it. What you need to be doing is reading me. And there was never an episode that announced that more brazenly, I think, than Sakizuke. I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. Kokio has finally been dethroned for me. Sakizuke is my favorite episode by far.
I think so much so that I think Hassun, which we'll get to, which is a perfectly solid episode in its way, but boy, you feel like, I've just come out of the end of something so special that the follow-up is always going to be.
And it's as you say, it's not any fault of Hassun. That most, Hassun's a great episode. It's a really good episode. But it
tells you a lot about Sakizuke, that Hassun feels like a bit of light relief after the.
Well, it does. I mean, my phrase for it, funnily enough, was, that felt like a palate cleanser. That's right.
Well, first of all, the opening for Sakizuke is arguably the most horrible, the most viscerally, visually horrible in the entire show.
And yet again, about getting inside text, the cliche of the chase through the cornfield at night, and yet it's completely revitalized in that scene. And I love the sort of strange geography of it, that he's suddenly on a cliff edge and then in the water. What is the geography of this place?
So we
definitely are in the area of dreams and nightmares, the subconscious.
Cliffs.
Shouldn't be there.
No, right. It shouldn't work, should it? It shouldn't geographically work. But that is consistent with the nature of this show. Time and space, they increasingly break down. And again, we keep saying it, but when we get season 3, in fact, when we get towards the end of season 2, it really goes off the rails. But season 3,
deliberate, isn't it? I mean, you can't follow even the way the opening of that episode is shot, where everything is revealed in a kind of granular way. It's like, oh my god, now we're on top of it. They know what they're doing. they know what they're subverting.
It's so deliberate. It's a painting, isn't it? It's an animated painting. It's something that's contrived by humanity, and therefore you can kind of do what you want with it. The limits are imagination. I mean, Hannibal even has that line where he talks about I don't know the exact phrase that he uses, but the French term for cracks in paintings, referring to the dead bodies, which is how they eventually find the mural and everything. Well, that's his comment upon reality in many respects. To him, it is all art. It is all a gigantic painting. And you get some wonderful reveals about what Hannibal actually is and what he's motivated by in this episode. Like, I love
this is the great statement for me. This is the great statement where it becomes clear, that he is the Miltonic satanic humanist. I mean, but I mean, we'll get to this, but I mean, you get the likening of the cracks in the glue that the people have been plastered with to the Craquelure in paintings.
Yes.
There are a whole host of references to the Renaissance in this, but how does he find the place? He finds it because he smells the corn that has got the grains of corn that have gotten into the cracks, and he sees the corn growing from the cracks. So what we have there is a literal version, things grow in the cracks. That is, and it's also the furrow where you plant, and it's so multi-layered.
Well, the fact that beginning looks like a Norman Rockwell painting plunged into a nightmare. I mean, that's deeply unsettling, particularly for an American audience, where the Rockwell paintings are so part of that view of rural America, and the romance,
it's
of it,
also
the heroism of it, and the carving of the garden out of nature, and this nightmare is put into it.
It's also the summoning of the iconography of rural Americana, farming, the farmlands of America and stuff like that, and the only way it could be more on the nose is if instead of corn it were cotton.
Yeah.
Because what you have here, I mean, they could have done that, but it would be more perfect in the sense that it would fit in more for me anyway, the way I partly read this episode, but it would kind of betray the show's determination to never quite be that simple, if you know what I mean. Because we don't want this to be about anything simple and direct.
Right.
No,
it is still, despite what Hannibal says about, this guy, the muralist, the killer, he is the ultimate example of the white guy who says, "I don't see color," isn't he? And yet he is still a white man who feels perfectly entitled to take the bodies of black and brown people for his own purposes, to use them for his own purposes. And we get the scene of the white man chasing a black man who has escaped from captivity. The phrase "he tore himself free." Well, that's a phrase that sums up the idea of the black man who escaped slavery and runs. Like Frederick Douglass. I prayed with my legs, and he's chasing him through the cornfields with a gun.
He's in the silo. When they're all in the silo, it's like being on the ships. It's like people
they're packed together.
Packed below decks, and
the bodies packed together like on the slave ship, or stored like the produce of a farm. It is so.
But what's interesting
redolent
there about
Jack,
about the cotton, because of course the corn carries it has a semiotic weight of its own, but it's not as direct. So that's right. And but the thing that really struck me, of course, about that mural is, other than its political connotation, the mural is the show's own color palette. I mean, that's the chilling thing, is when you suddenly realize, hang on a moment, this is the color palette. These are the colors the show uses. Oh,
yeah. And also, what does it look at? What is it looking at? It's looking for God, and who does it ultimately see? It sees Hannibal. It's ours, isn't it? It's our eye,
the eye pops his head in.
I really want to get to this, but I want to sort of finish up one thing at a time. You're absolutely right, Elliot, about the color palette of the show, because the show has the, so to speak, color palette, the casting color palette of a show of its time and still ours. And yet we are still talking about, again, we've mentioned this before, the idea of like trying to deny the existence of the structural oppression and the historic oppression by putting this kind of PC United Colors of Benetton wash over everything. And that is precisely what is being critiqued, or it's part of what's being critiqued here, because that is what the muralist is doing. He is the guy who says that he doesn't see color, and yet because he is actually hyper obsessed with color. This is what Hannibal says when Hannibal is helping the team, and he says absolutely this person sees no value in his fellow humans beyond their color. He is the ultimate example of the reduction of human beings to color and the categorization of people through color. And what you get is this incredible mural of like the human color palette, and the instinct is to kind of appreciate it. The instinct is to say, well, look how different we all are. Look how we all blend into each other. And yet at the same time, of course, what's been done is this monstrous. It's not just monstrous in the sense that these people have been killed and imprisoned in that sense, but it's it's arrangement, isn't it? In terms of the creation of the work of art, what he's doing is creating a picture. But in terms of what he's actually doing with bodies, is he is arranging bodies on this spectrum that mirrors the kinds of spectrums of humanity that were created by scientific racism.
Yeah, and it's the reduction of humanity to commodity, isn't it? I mean, humanity,
Absolutely.
Hannibal, to think ultimately.
They're in a fucking silo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that
absolutely.
Hannibal sees the worth in it. That's the most amazing thing. He sees he only sees the metaphysics. He only sees the abstraction of it, and he gets angry doesn't he get a little bit shirty, doesn't he, with the guy when he says there is no God, when he says the eye sees nothing, and he's quite not with that.
Fundamentally disagrees with this work of art, because he appreciates it as a work of art. He says to him, "I love your work," but then he has the conversation with the man as he's putting him into his own picture, and they see the world differently. The man is saying, he says there is no God, and Hannibal says brilliantly, he replies, "Certainly not with that attitude."
Certainly not with that attitude. Yeah,
that tells you exactly where they're coming from relative to each other, because the muralist. His idea is, I express the fact that I look out and I see nothing but darkness. There's nothing but shades of darkness, color. We're talking about color again.
Yeah.
I see nothing looking back at me. There's nothing there, and that is horrifying. There is only man. Man, capital M, looks around, looks out into the universe. And there's no light, there's no answering reflection, there's no God, there's nothing. That's what he sees. That's what he's trying to express. And it's like this sort of monstrous temper tantrum, isn't it? It's like
it is. It so is. It's
I'm going to shit the bed. Right? Yeah, it's this great dirty protest. Like I'm looking for this thing that I want, I want to see me and recognize how special I am, and I don't see it. So I'm going to do this.
There is no eye of God looking at me, and I'm angry about it. I'm angry about the fact.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, that he puts it into the silo, as you say, Elliot, but it's also from the inside, looking up. It's the Pantheon in Rome, with the hole at the top, the name of which is architecturally that's called the oculus, the eye.
Yes.
And it's supposed to be the place where you go to worship all the gods. And this guy has done an inverted. He's turned the eye inside out, because there are no gods. So all there is just the people inside. Hannibal loves the ambition, and the flamboyance of it as a work of art, but he sees the world completely differently. And so he puts the artist into his own work of art. And that works beautifully, because there are loads of artists buried in the Pantheon in Rome. Raphael is buried in the Pantheon. And he mentions the artists who included themselves in their own portraits. Velasquez does that a lot. Hannibal particularly mentions Piero della Francesca. Piero della Francesca painted himself into the Resurrection as one of the guards. Hannibal takes the muralist's leg. One of the famous things about Piero della Francesca's Resurrection is that one of the guards, he has no legs. That you can't fit him spatially into that picture. But the point is that Hannibal changes the meaning of the painting, because he changes the color. He puts the white man into the spot where Roland Umber was supposed to be, the darkness. Suddenly there's this whiteness, and Hannibal is still using human skin color, but he's using it to say the opposite. He's using it to say, well, there is a reflection, there is a chink of light, there is something or somebody looking back at us, but it's still man. It is still
this notion of finding
humans.
God in oneself, isn't it? It's this notion. That's what Hannibal sees. It's this notion that we are the divine. It's the satanic message. It's the satanic message, isn't it? It's the Miltonian satanic message. The divine is ours. It's ours. It's our inspirations. It's our passions. It's our desires. You'd see it by looking in, not out.
It's different from nihilism.
It's Renaissance humanism. This is what the Renaissance was about, with its concentration upon the human body. It's concentration upon the nude figure. It is about seeing the divinity of humanity, the centrality to the universe of humanity, and expressing that through the idea of the human as divine, as having a spark of the divine.
So it's a simplistic interpretation. When Hannibal goes up on top of the silo and looks down, you get the eye looking at him. The simplistic interpretation is to see it as ego, right? Oh, it's Hannibal placing himself in the position of God. And that's kind of true, but it's also not the entirety of the truth. It's because Hannibal understands this. If there is something to see, if there is something divine, it's in us. It's in what we are.
But it's also playful.
Yes, no, this episode. I'll just round this off, if you don't mind. I'll just round this off because it rhymes beautifully. The thing that does that, the thing that Hannibal sees, is why his take is, as you say, a satanic kind of humanism, as opposed to the kind of Renaissance sacred humanism that is being expressed by somebody like Michelangelo, for instance. It's the Miltonic version of the same, and it's because Hannibal sees it, the divinity of man, the spark of divinity in man, in man's ability to create, and even to create art, to create illusions, even to create the illusion of God. It's certainly not with that attitude. You can put God there if you have the right attitude. Yeah. It's human will, which is why it rhymes too perfectly. Hannibal is in love with will.
Yeah. He's
in love with he's in love with human will.
There's several jokes going on, isn't there? Because there is that reference to human will, but there is also the fact that when he is sewing the artist into the mural and he's talking about the eye of God, the guy's looking at him. But I think there's a lot of because there's still something. I mean, I think that Hannibal is both sincere in terms of the context you've just described, Jack, but of course he is also playful. He is the Miltonic Lucifer. So he also needs God in his cosmology because he needs someone to take on.
So Satan loves God. He's heartbroken at the start because he's exiled from heaven.
So of course,
warring exes,
Hannibal is going to say, is going to lend credence to the concept of God, both work because they are distorted reflections of one another, both as the sense that God is created in man's image rather than the other way around, and therefore there is the divine, and creation connects us to the divine. But also the fact that Hannibal himself needs God to take on.
Yeah, of course. When we get their ultimate communion later on in the Red Dragon story, he will actively cast Will as the Lamb.
Exactly.
As Christ.
And even the throwaway comments
the subject of Francesca's resurrection.
Yes.
God wrapped in man.
Killing.
Exactly right.
That's another way that Hannibal basically says, I am a rival to God. But I think it explodes. What's interesting about this is it explodes across all periods of art. I mean, I think what you were saying there about the Renaissance is absolutely right. But, it's very easy also to think about I mean, the thing I thought about was a lot of course, the body very much came, and of course it connects to Renaissance art because it's the symbolic value of changes in or shifts in historical moments, and of course, as we symbolically ran towards the millennium just gone, there was an awful lot of body art and meat-based art and mutilation of the body, so to speak, in contemporary art, almost as a kind of neo-paganistic thing. But I kept thinking, when he took the leg, the first thing I thought of was, I don't know if you guys have ever read or heard about, this is back in the 90s. Yeah, I think, or maybe it was the 80s. But there was a Dutch artist called Rob Schulte, and it's the most extraordinary story in kind of contemporary art world. He had an assassination attempt made on him by a rival artist, and it was a car bomb. So his car was fitted with a bomb, and he was caught in the explosion, and it took his leg. And I think he ended up donating the leg to something, but I think the rival artist had tried to take the leg as a trophy. And I just kept thinking, my God, this almost seems too perfect a rhyme, because it all sort of exploded out of that. I guess it was like the antecedent is things like Andre Breton's "If you shoot a revolver into a crowd, that's a work of art," or Thomas de Quincey's murder is art and so on. And all the way through that scene, of course, Hannibal, as well as being Lucifer, as well as he's kind of playing Robert Hughes by way of John Berger all the way through that episode, isn't he? I mean, there's a wonderful moment where he's rhapsodizing about Roland Umber's corpse, and Jack Crawford has just this wonderful moment of eyeing him as if saying, Will didn't do this kind of stuff, and you're seriously worrying me about you're rhapsodizing about this just a little too much. But all these things can come together, the idea of the focus on the body and Renaissance art, because again there's a massive tectonic historical shift going on. And then, of course, the concentration back on the body and meat and scarification, neo-paganism in the run-up to the turn of the last millennium. There's so many interesting rhymes just in the set piece of the mural.
Of the mural, yeah,
and
absolutely.
Relationship to it.
And it also, it defines sort of an artistic theme throughout this season. That's another thing that happens from this point on. There is a sort of artistic theme for each season. In this season, it's the Renaissance. In season 3, it's going to be the Romantics.
And I love in that scene, actually, I know I'm being a bit frivolous, but I just love how Hannibal in that scene, when they have Roland Umber's corpse, becomes this rather bumbling figure in everyone's way.
I love that.
Attempting to fill the vacuum left by Will at the autopsy, until he spots, the term he can use, the cracking of Umber's skin. He's either playing at, or I can't work out if Hannibal is playing at it or he really is the odd man out in everyone's way. He's sort of hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, he hasn't quite grown into the
manners thing going on there.
Yeah, he hasn't quite grown into the skin of Will that he's trying to inhabit at this point, right? He's not quite there yet.
He goes behind his back to consult Will. The new boy isn't cutting it. The disgraced old hand is still essential to them. That's fascinating because Hannibal is placed to us is such a kind of impervious character in a sense, and I love the way this episode actually subverted that.
Yeah, it's nice when he's disarmed, isn't it? It's nice when he's disarmed.
Yeah, I wondered about how to read that moment, because it's very deliberately done. It's very in common with lots of things about this show, and particularly these episodes. It's very over-defined. It's definitely there to be noticed. They're doing something specific there, and I puzzled over that. What is that? And I feel like the point of that is that Hannibal is very different from Will, because Hannibal gets right up close to the body. Hannibal wants to be next to the body with his face right up, and his nose right up. Whereas Will would always sort of be hanging back in the corner of the room, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
I feel like that's the point.
It's something that Jack
Hannibal
says
gets in the way, because he's actually focused on the body itself.
And Jack catches something.
Yeah.
From that,
it's
he
interesting.
has his moment of there's a flicker, and it's played very well. Of just like, hang on a moment. Not only is this just different because it's a different man and it's a different, but there's something not quite right about behavior.
It may be the first subconscious flicker.
Yeah.
That maybe Will's telling the truth when he says that Hannibal did this to me. It won't flower yet for a long time.
But if you just follow him. Jack
it's the seed in the crack.
Exactly
there it is.
Right.
There it is.
Exactly that. And it's something that
really interesting reactive performance work.
Yeah, it's something Jack notes in his testimony in Hassun when he says that Will hates the work.
Yes,
Will hates it. I mean, and that is only true, of course, in season 1. It's going to start to not be true in season 2. Very, very soon.
We kind of talked about this before. I mean, there is the whole thing in season 1. I think it might actually be in Coquille, where they are sort of going back and forth, but Hannibal and Will, about whether or not Will should be taken off this kind of work, and Will, he's constantly saying to Jack, take me off this work, without actually saying it. But when he's faced with the possibility of that happening, he sort of furiously backtracks. He doesn't. He does. Will is, for all that he is very definitely a manipulative, controlling character, Jack Crawford is actually being controlled by Will. in that episode, particularly in that episode.
Very much
Will
so.
wants to be doing this, no matter how traumatic and destabilizing he finds it. He does want to be doing it.
Of course he does, and because Jack sees things in such black and white terms, which is apropos for this episode, of course, he sees things in functional terms. That's all he sees. So Will hates the word.
Jack is also in Hassun. In Hassun, Jack is in complete sort of self-flagellating mode. He sort of falls on his sword at the trial and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's still completely narcissistic. It's still totally about him. It's about him wallowing in guilt and taking responsibility in order to make himself feel better.
And he does.
So when he says,
you see it in the scene after his testimony with Hannibal, he's quite sanguine after that. He's unburdened himself. He's confessed his sins, and therefore he's okay now.
But it's even when he sees the therapist, he has learned nothing from Miriam Lass. He's learned nothing from that experience. He still pushes. He pushes Beverly. He goes and offloads himself to the therapist as if it's a father confessor. But it's just show and tell.
Yeah,
it doesn't
that scene is directly, he is directly connected via the bridging dialogue, which would the end of the dialogue at the end of one scene is echoed by Jack's dialogue at the start of that scene, and it's about how he just sees people as a means to an end. He just uses people. And Jack Crawford in that scene, it becomes very clear that the thing that's bothering him is the idea that he failed. He actually says, "I failed," and that's clearly the thing that's bothering him. The idea that he might have made a mistake, or that he might have been seen to make a mistake. Elsewhere in the episode, or in Sakizuke, he's just repeating the exact same mistakes, because Beverly Katz is actually taking it because she's got his number. She knows about his hypocrisy and his bad faith. She's got him. She does the better to ask forgiveness than permission thing when she goes to see Will. She knows, but she's manipulating him in that scene where he's ostensibly disciplining her. She's manipulating him far more than he's managing to manipulate her, in very much the same way that Will used to, actually. And she's doing it via that need of his for the idea of control over people.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's the same leash that Hannibal uses. Hannibal sees this in Jack as well. And that's exactly what he uses to ingratiate himself.
Yeah, they have the conversation in the episode where Hannibal and Jack talk about Bella's cancer, where Hannibal, he says to him, that the thing that bothers you is, I can't remember exactly what it is, but he manipulates Jack via completely inverting Jack's personality at him in a very flattering way.
Yeah, he does it in a way that makes it seem like he's being sympathetic. It's actually beautifully conceived and played. It's a beautiful piece of work.
He sort of tells Jack to take control in that scene that I'm thinking of. Whereas the problem, of course, is that Jack wants to try to control everything and everybody all the time.
All the time.
And it's interesting because he plays upon Jack's fear of the things that he can't control as well. Jack says something like, "I've dedicated my life to death," because Jack is considering retiring at this point, giving up control. Or so he says, anyway.
So he says, yeah.
And Hannibal says, "And now death has followed you home. Come to live in your house." In reference to Bella and her cancer. It's really fascinating what he's doing there.
That's a heck of a line he says as well.
Isn't it?
Something along the lines of, "You don't need to get in the hole with her."
You don't need to get in the ground. Yeah, you don't need to go into the ground with her, he says.
So it's like, well, and you think, how on earth is he going to react to that line?
Yeah. And it must be a difficult one to play, because it sounds, if you saw it on the page, you would think that it sounds antagonistic.
Yeah,
right?
That's it. I think my sort of actor's brain went, what do you do with a line like that? Because it's very audacious, but you've got to find a way to. That would have been an interesting puzzler.
But in the same sense, it's Hannibal demonstrating just how well he knows Jack. Because Jack is the kind of guy who would be proud of appreciating that kind of straightforwardness, in terms of advice. So it's another form of manipulation. Hannibal's adapting the way he normally speaks when he's speaking to Jack.
Yes, yeah.
It's just
it's what comes across, I think, increasingly in this episode as well. Actually, both of them to an extent, is, you know, Hannibal is, as you know, he is this remote figure, someone with links to people based on either a rather skewered power dynamic or, you know, professional interest. But we you know, it's there, it's established. He's essentially kind of lonely, the Lucifer figure, the Dracula figure, and all these characters, like Lucifer, like Dracula, they all crave connection of some sort. They crave of course, as we've discussed, they crave a different order, or a different conception of beauty, as with the mural and so on. But as long as people's perceptions of beauty and death and art and murder or morality are diametrically opposed, people like Hannibal stand alone in the world. So it comes into focus that despite everything he's done, there's almost like, oh, there's a moment of regret here, because he craves Will, because Will is the closest person he can find who can at the very least be coaxed and to see the world in a way he recognizes. He just sort of needs, if you like, elevating to the next step.
Yeah.
That's consort or inheritor, I think, is up for grabs until season 3. And I think it explains why Hannibal, as we've often said, you know, doesn't seem to have a grand design. It's more experimentation. He is reactive, maybe smaller plans within plans or whatever. But it really comes across in this one, and it's sort of linked in that what I was saying earlier about when he's sort of almost bumbling around. He's a bit lost.
Yeah.
Now that Will's separated from him, and there's almost, it's regret. So it really does put a puncture through that idea of the grand design.
It absolutely is, because in Hassun, he tries to give Will a lifeline. He tries to utilize something that he doesn't expect, which is, of course, another serial killer trying to either make contact with Will or provide him with a potential alibi for the crimes he's been convicted of. And he tries to manipulate Will into using that as his defense. And it seems as though he is sincere, that he is really, he wants Will out. He actually says to Will in a conversation with him in Hassun, "I don't want you to be in here." Yeah. And Will says, "I don't want to be in here either."
Because he seems to resist his own ideas for Will. And I think this episode, it really comes through. And then he sort of recapitulates and seems to want to push Will on again. But
he's conflicted about Will. He's massively conflicted.
It's the conflict. It's the conflict. Absolutely. But I just think these, particularly the first of these, really finally not I don't think it's necessarily hammered home, but there is a real sense now that it's like, this is an experiment, this is a man of whims, and hypercycles within hypercycles, rather than someone who has this great cosmic plan. I mean, no more than in Paradise Lost, that Lucifer has a great plan. He doesn't. He is reactive.
No, he doesn't.
There's wonderful moments in the early sequences when all the other fallen angels are sort of demanding answers from him, and he's sort of brooding. He doesn't have that.
No, at the beginning of Paradise Lost,
we talked about this last time.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lucifer,
he does that internal monologue when he basically says,
"I've slept since then, Jack. I'm so sorry.
They need something. My legions, they've lost everything. They've lost heaven. They need something, or they will destroy themselves." You know, it's amazing.
He comes up with a rationale, not a motive.
Yeah, that's it.
Very much like Iago. We talked about that last time.
Very much. I mean, there's a beautiful scene in, I think it's in Hassun, actually, where Hannibal is talking to Will. But yes, it is in Hassun. It's about the, I think it's about the murder that occurs. That seems to be like all of Will Graham's greatest hits in one murder. And Hannibal basically confesses to Will, and I don't even know if it's a conscious thing, if he even understands that he's doing it. He has the line, "This killer sent you a poem. Are you going to ignore his love?" And it's like, this is you.
Yeah.
You're talking about yourself.
Yeah.
This is like the closest you have come to actually putting into words to Will what you think and feel about him.
Yeah, except that it's, you know, this isn't, I mean, from the point of view of the audience watching this for the first time, it's still ambiguous.
Yes, of course.
We know, of course, that these murders are not being committed by Hannibal. They're a copycat of a copycat, and they're not good enough poems. You know, they're vulgar and derivative and overly literal and stuff like that. That's why it doesn't work as a defense at trial, because it's not. It's not elegant enough. You know, it's fanfic. He's actually described as an avid. They take the line "avid fan," which is originally from Red Dragon. It's how Dollhide signs his letter to Lecter in Red Dragon. They use that for this guy, and that's what this is. This is bad fanfic. That's why it doesn't work. Hannibal is kind of. It's almost a sort of. It's a forlorn hope that he can use the acolyte, I think he refers to him as a way to get Will, because Will is at the moment pretending to not believe, or at least not be sure now, that Hannibal is the killer. He's pretending, and he's a very, by the way, this episode, Hassun, I think it's Hassun, it's one of them anyway, reveals Will to be an extremely good liar. He's very, very good at faking emotions and pretending to be thinking and feeling things that he's not.
He spins in that episode quite a bit in very interesting ways. I think it's Dancy's best performance, actually.
Me too. I think the shift between Will in season 1 and season 2 is absolutely brilliant. How many like popular TV shows do this, by the way, where arguably the protagonist shifts dynamic so profoundly?
Well, you know, it happens, but it's called Flanderization. It's where characters get flattened out and simplified over the course of a series, where you know one of their traits becomes their defining characteristic. So in the first season, somebody will have several different characteristics. Maybe they're not all that coherent as a character yet, because they're working from scripts that you know, the writers have never seen these characters on screen yet. By the time you get to season 4 or 5 of whatever, I mean, you know, the character of Picard in Star Trek, by the way, is, you know, he's a classic example of this. Picard, for all that the first couple of seasons are rough sledding some of the time, the characters are often a lot more complicated, because they haven't hammered it out yet. They don't quite make the same kind of sense. By the time you get to season 3 or 4, the writers know exactly who Picard is, etc., etc. And in some ways they become kind of less interesting. They get their spikier and rougher edges smoothed out.
I mean, Picard's characterization in the later seasons of Star Trek: The Next Generation is impossible to connect with Patrick Stewart's performance from the first few seasons that is still obviously carrying on through. And I do seem to recall, and I don't think it's a very good episode personally. I think it's acclaimed in Trek circles, but I think it's pretty lousy. And it's the one where he basically gets his Christmas Carol with Q and sees himself younger, and it's like, that's not Picard. I don't know who that guy is. Even if you allow for some kind of transformation of personality or whatever, it's just not. It's awful, but it's awful on a number of fronts. It's got terrible ethics and politics, but it's just like, no, I can't buy that for a second. That does not ring true, because because obviously, as it sort of fits with what you're saying, Jack. In the early stages of quite a lot of television drama, the characters are so open because no one's really decided what they are yet. It's all up for grabs. But of course, actors are freighting in what they, and very often, because it's the difficulty of being an actor, unless you've got a complete character presented to you, and those things usually come in tried and tested theatrical pieces, or you know, an adaptation, for example. What you end up doing is bringing so much of you to it, because you know that's why you've been cast anyway. So you bring all those things that have readily got you from characters you've been cast as before, because that part of your logical brain says, oh well, I get why I was asked to play, for example, Iago, or why I was asked to play that character in Pinter's The Homecoming or whatever. So I've got to bring kind of those things to this character which hasn't been settled yet and is up for grabs. And then of course later on, in their attempt to nail it down, it actually becomes even less consistent. It doesn't make any sense. But to get us back on track, we're at this point where everything is, and as you say, unusually, George, everything is now exploding in lots of different directions with almost everyone's character.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, that might
fluidity
be
of
Hassun's
identity is baked in,
greatest
right?
strength, because it does a courtroom drama, which, it's that thing that a lot of American TV shows default to, usually when they can't think of anything else to do. But if there's one strength here, is it's suddenly either allowing characters such as Jack Crawford to articulate themselves in ways like, oh, right, okay, but it's muddying the waters, because we know that Jack Crawford is a narcissist.
Yes.
We know he's a control freak. Or it plays a wonderful trick with Freddie Lowndes in about 8 lines.
Yeah,
but just the way
Freddie
she
in the
turns up
trial.
and
My God.
but it's
so
brilliant.
great.
It's a fantastic
She turns
moment.
up dressed as a femme fatale from a 40s
Yes,
film noir.
yes.
She's so thought about everything about her presentation.
And on the stand, she plays it as like this doe-eyed, nervous innocent.
Yeah.
And in 8 lines,
Will's lawyer gets her number immediately.
is-
right?
She absolutely buries Will. She is savage in that.
Yeah.
She is just digging his fucking grave.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And then he's
And
absolutely
then you get the joke.
completely
You get the
demolished.
joke with how many times she's been sued, and you get six.
And how many times have you settled? 6. Yeah. No further questions. But I mean, like, going back, like, fluidity of identity, of course, is baked into the themes of the show. So here, characters changing and transforming is not as a result of inconsistent writing. It's because that's what they do.
Yeah.
That's their nature. That's the project of the show, right? And to do it so profoundly with Will, I mean, the tonal shift between Hugh Dancy's performance in season 1 and these episodes is incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah. He
Show
really comes into something here. Because
It
I
really
said
does.
before, I don't think it's an easy part to play, and it's quite easy. Again, the word easy, for him to be reduced by the clarity of other characters and the fact that they can have the kinds of connections with each other which Will by definition can't. But he really has he seized on these scripts in this season.
Oh, absolutely. And
In
he
fact,
does things with his performance that are beautiful.
being
Absolutely
made remote
beautiful.
and actually out of the picture, losing agency, has actually upped his agency in the most fascinating way.
Well, they're all reacting to him, aren't they? Every single character in this, he's at the center of the web here now. He's
trying to seize control from the narrative from the outside, which is a very interesting place to try and seize it from.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just little things Hugh Dancy does in this season with his performance. Even this early on, you can see that the show is trying to introduce in the audience's mind a certain ambiguity with regards to, well, okay, we know he didn't commit the murders of which he is accused, but it's starting to plant the seeds that he is not an innocent.
No,
there's other stuff going on here that's going to flower much later on, of course. The thing we are starting to see what Hannibal sees in him, which is his higher self, of course.
Yeah.
What Hannibal preconceives as his higher self.
This is kind of where I was going when I mentioned that this episode reveals to us what a tremendously spectacularly good liar Will is, how incredibly good he is at faking intense emotions, because it doesn't. To us, it's completely convincing. It doesn't fool Hannibal. Hannibal and Will are engaged in a dance here. Will is pretending to believe that Hannibal, to now believe that Hannibal isn't the copycat, or at least to be uncertain about it. He's pretending to be uncertain of anything and stuff like that, and to be, and Hannibal is pretending to believe that, but he also clearly doesn't believe it, and it's also clear that Will knows he doesn't believe it, and that Hannibal knows Will knows that he doesn't believe it. So there is sincerity. Like Hannibal is clearly. I mean, I read this way anyway. Hannibal is sincerely moved when the idea of the acolyte being the copycat, being the same person, is discarded, because he when he's talking to Will about it, it's clear that he was really grasping for that as a way for Will to believe him again.
Exactly, yeah. Well, it's why he does what he does to the judge
to be his
at
friend.
the end of Hassun. It's why he does that to him, because it's like, how dare you? How dare you not accept my testimony? How dare you not free my friend?
Well, that's interesting. Is that because I can't quite remember? Is it Hannibal that does that, or is it the?
It's Hannibal.
Is it the? It's Hannibal
Hannibal.
that kills the judge, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't find
really
out for a long time yet. You don't find out for a long time. There's a conversation between the copycat of the copycat and Hannibal. You know, when he's got Hannibal strung up in a later episode.
Yeah.
In the swimming pool. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He says to him, "Oh, I didn't do the judge. That wasn't me. It was Hannibal that did that."
The other thing is, it also feels. I mean, I love the layering of this series. It also feels somewhat reckless because if we're to pick up on the point of Hannibal is now, maybe I've taken the wrong turning here with separating Will. It's not a case of trying to inhabit its world. He needs to be in my orbit. It almost seems like a reckless thing to do. Right. Well, I've got to sort this trial out. How do I sort the trial out? I'll kill the judge.
I'll kill the judge.
So it again, it's one of the strengths of this particular cluster of episodes. It's playing on so many different possibilities.
Yeah. He does. I mean, he congratulates himself about it as well. He's talking to Jack about the trial at the end, and Jack says, "Well, there will be a mistrial now. You know, the trial will just go on." And Hannibal says something like, "Well, it's an elegant, if somewhat unorthodox solution."
Yeah.
It's very literal though for Hannibal, isn't it? It's very.
Yeah. Well, I think what he's doing, he's doing a really interesting thing here. He's trying to do what he feels the copycat might do for Will.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. Hannibal is deliberately slumming it in terms of his artistic conception. He's deliberately done something that's quite crude and literal rather than what he would normally do, which would be more figurative and metaphorical and oblique. Yeah,
and it just wouldn't have so clear symbolism, you know, where you've got the scales and you've got the heart and the brain, and it's like, justice is heartless and mindless, blah 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 blah.
He would exactly. It's a clockwork allegory, isn't it? Which is not Hannibal's thing at all.
It's just, I mean, also he's just not interested in that kind of thing. I mean, he wouldn't give a shit about that.
I mean, I think there's a case to be made that, you know, I could imagine him doing it because the thing is so mocking. It's so pointed of what has been a waste, as easy a waste of his time, really.
Yes.
So you know, it could, you know, I don't think it's entirely without you know. Part of me thinks, oh, he has to act quick. Part of me thinks, oh, it has to be to you know, with the copycat or the copycat of the copycat, and then another part of me thinks, oh no, you know, sometimes artists are very on the line if the particular
also I think there's a temper tantrum element
piss
here
them
too.
off. Yeah,
you know, I really get the impression here with this one that he's acting quite impulsively, and it's because of Will. It's because Will's been insulted. You know, nobody gets to do that.
Can't get cerebral when you're feeling like that.
And he is definitely trying to make it look like the acolytes work, because he kills the judge before he mutilates him, which is the tell, isn't it, with the other guy. That's how they know that the first body that turns up, the prison guard, wasn't the work of the copycat. Yeah. So he is definitely trying to mock copycat the copycat of the copycat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a funny episode in many ways, though, because I think this is why I think I thought that the term palate cleansers kind of worked, because I noticed there was an awful lot of, maybe it's where it sits in the season, but it did feel like, oh, we're being brought up to speed on things we already know, but almost for the benefit of every character. It's like, well, if we put them all in the same room together and bring everyone up to speed, then we can just leap on. And obviously a courtroom setting means that everyone is privy to each other's testimony. Yes. But there were just a few points. Again, it's a niggle, because I think coming off the back of that previous episode, I really didn't care if what they did. It's so good that it's like, okay, fine. But it felt a bit like, oh, we're just hammering everything out a bit and just reiterating a few points and maybe making sure that if later on in the plot character X needs to know about character Y, but character X and Y don't cohabit the same in working environment. Well, this is a way that they will both be able to hear. But, if things like that seem to be happening, it seems much more nuts and bolts. Which
it's
I
kind
have
of
to say,
reintroducing all the characters as well, right?
Yeah,
it's allowing the audience to see, here's our cast, here's our players.
I mean, at least they did. I mean, it's not the greatest episode ever, but at least they managed to do that kind of nuts and bolts stuff with a bit of wit, and a few iconic moments. And
love Chilton
considering and him basically describing Hannibal without realizing it is just wonderful.
He is such. Not only is he a shit, he is incompetent. It's great.
Yes, but the great thing about Chilton is he's not just incompetent. He says the right things and he misappropriates them, or he talks about them because he cracks so many important plot points. Chilton, for Christ's sake, that up later. He is inept, but we're right back to what Jack was saying earlier. Our Jack, not Jack Crawford, which is this show isn't playing by strict. Oh well, we've got this character that Chilton, and he's got to be a dunderhead. He's got to. No, it moves it around. It twists it, and that's because that's what makes him much more interesting as a character. Like, you're almost there, Chilton.
Almost
there.
So almost. You know what I love? He says that he doesn't have a personal relationship with Will, and that's how he knows that Will is this creature for which there is not yet a name.
Yes.
When of course he absolutely has a personal relationship with Will, and it's completely antagonistic. They hate one another. It's very clear they dislike one another. And of course, I mean, you have to bear in mind, it's Chilton who cracks Hannibal later.
Yeah.
He's the one who fingers Hannibal later on.
He's the one
who first one to believe. So
I will say, for all that this is a bit of a nuts and bolts episode, but saved by those moments of wit and those great lines and those great turns of characters, and the imagery. I think it's the best use of the Wendigo. I mean, I gasped just having him in the dock, and they're handing the Bible, and they cut back to an interesting long shot as well, it's a very obvious piece of symbolism. We know what it means, but it's the first time that it's made me go.
This is one of the things that frustrates me slightly about this episode, which is that it sort of half does a thing where it has the trial as a kind of crucible that reveals, as a place where the truth about the characters is revealed. Whether they know it or not, whether anybody knows it or not, we, the audience, watch them on the stand under oath. And we joked in the back channel about the moment when Hannibal takes his oath on the Bible. And I swear to God, there's a little sizzling sound in the Foley. I swear to God, there is.
I've got to go back.
I've played it 3 times, and I swear when he puts his hand on the Bible, there's a little noise.
That's so good.
But
given how intent on Mads was on playing this guy as Lucifer, I wouldn't be surprised if he insisted.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. No, but when he goes on the witness stand, he is seen as the Wendigo. That is, only by Will, obviously, but he is revealed thus. And Chilton's true nature is absolutely revealed on the stand, as the man who is very intelligent, very insightful, but can't get all the way there because of his personal hang-ups.
Yeah. And his ego, right?
Yeah, his ego, exactly.
All the time.
And Alana, my God, the prosecutor absolutely skewers Alana. She skewers her selfishness and her self-delusion. Yeah. And her hypocrisy. And the same with Jack Crawford. The only thing that scrambles it, strangely, is Freddie Lowndes. Because Freddie, I can't see how what we see there is Freddie being revealed. She's still completely camouflaged to me there. So maybe that's all it is. Maybe the revelation of Freddie is that there's really nothing to reveal.
It's on the surface, right? All masks all the way down.
It's all performance. Yeah.
Yeah. Although it could be my rather fanciful idea that Freddy and Hannibal can't get revealed in that kind of crucible-like context because they are the absolute opposite axes of this of the same spectrum, and therefore they are the most morally pure characters, oddly, and therefore they are not visible because they stand outside of this of a world that's actually mostly populated by characters who are kind of morally bankrupt, whether that's Alana, whether that's Jack Crawford, whether in a strange way Hannibal and Freddie Lounds is superficially morally bankrupt because she's basically Paris Hilton, but for reasons we've discussed before, and the way this show operates, she and Hannibal exist on a very on opposite ends of the same spectrum, and everyone else is somewhere else.
The two characters that are just they're not operating on human morality at all.
No.
Right. And in that regard, there's a certain purity to them because bizarrely they are morally consistent.
Exactly. You either eat all meat or you eat no meat, as I've said before.
Yes.
Is the connection between them. Therefore, it makes them the most ethically sound characters in a strange sort of way, because everyone else is a hypocrite.
Yeah. And you know what? Everyone else in the show is a murderer, either directly or by proxy, and Freddie Lounds isn't.
No.
I never pegged that before, but almost even like the children, even characters like Abigail, plays. It's really I never pegged that before.
She's so fascinating. She's really fascinating, and yet
she doesn't engage in physical violence with anyone. She is only ever the victim of physical violence by characters like Will and Jack Crawford.
Or she is able to identify it without obscuring the issue. I mean, she's the first one who basically points out that Will is aggressive and threatening, and she's right.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, again, it's this whole thing.
She has the quality of like a scrambling effect.
Yes,
she's a monkey wrench thrown into the works, isn't she?
She's the disruptor of the of that world.
She's the element that doesn't quite really ever fit or doesn't ever quite make sense, and as such, she's incredibly important and incredibly revelatory.
And I think
she's a bit like the show refusing, like at the start where I mentioned about how it would be more thematically consistent if it were a field of cotton, but they make it corn just so that it's not quite as straightforward, and just so that you can't quite read it as. She's a bit like that. She's
somewhat spectral.
She's this element that never agrees to fit in.
Well, that's it, because she's so spectral. I mean, not only, like as you say, turning up in court looking like a femme fatale from a 90s, like Lauren Bacall or something.
By the way,
Key Largo.
Well. Absolutely rocking it. She looks amazing.
She looks amazing. But also, this penchant she has for sort of turning up in highly secure places on the flimsiest of. She just emerges. She is this disruptive element. She's an elemental force. And Hannibal's an elemental force. So they have a very unusual crossover. They do have an unusual crossover.
There's a strange dreamlike quality to the trial, isn't there?
Yeah, it doesn't feel quite solid, does it? It doesn't feel quite set or there. It's like it is like a dream.
I mean, some of the bits of the trial, in terms of pure litigation and in terms of purely how courts work, even allowing for the disparities between the British and American judicial system, there were parts of that didn't make any sense at all.
Of course.
This is again so deliberately important, not lapses in research, but hang on a moment, the kicking out of that evidence didn't make any sense.
I mean, it really hammer home as well, like how strange this situation actually is, and how it can only operate in this abstract world. I mean, when they're describing Will and what he's being accused of, whatever interpretation you take, you either look at this is a guy who is the most intelligent serial killer ever born, who's found his way to operate in the FBI secretly and use that as his cover. Or you take it that he has the most bizarre psychology and he's being affected by the work that he's done to the point whereby his personality is fractured. I mean, trying to describe this on the stand, or for the prosecutor trying to describe this, it's so bizarre.
It's odd in the sense that it almost feels like if you take although the show is called Hannibal, but if you take Will as the protagonist, the show is only like 3 sidesteps away from something like Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner. It has that vibe to it, where Will is number 6.
Yeah, it so does. I think The Prisoner is a really good shout, actually. I think there is like a...
And that show keeps coming back to trials as well.
Yeah. But I think it was probably hit me more in that episode where the distortions and the way even its own internal reality gets fuzzy at the edges, and obviously the psychological assaults on the lead character and him saying things like, I feel the narrative of my life unraveling. I have lost the plot of my own. Whoa, this is so. As I say, it's like a second cousin of something like The Prisoner at the moment. And he is, of course, in prison at the moment.
So I was going to say, quite literally and figuratively. I mean, he says at one point I don't know whether it's in Hassun or in Sakizuke, but he's talking about how he's losing himself and how there's not much inside that he recognizes anymore. So he's kind of like a prisoner on multiple different levels.
Yeah. And that show was all about filling the protagonist with a sense of being something that the antagonists wanted him to be. You scramble them to they talked about initially, it was all about, why did you resign from your job? That's not really what it was about. It was about, we want you to lead this microcosm because there's something about you and your character and your rebellion which actually makes you the potentially the supreme establishment figure if we just change you. And of course you get a similar thing with Hannibal to Will. You're almost there. I just need to change you.
I think the big thematic difference between them is that here it feels true. Here it feels like the correct thing. When Hannibal says to Will, I want you to see the best in me as I see the best in you. And when Bedelia says to, I think she says it to Will, I sincerely believe that Hannibal believed he is acting in your own best interests. That is actually
he's doing what's
true
best for you. Which is, I love the way, I think what she actually says is, I believe that Hannibal is doing what he sincerely thinks is best for you, which is such an interesting formulation, isn't it? Because best for you doesn't mean necessarily.
Yeah, you've got to think that one through.
Exactly. And you also have that qualifier, sincerely thinks.
Yeah.
Not necessarily is, but sincerely thinks what is best for you. But I think that one of the deviations of this show is it kind of goes there. It kind of says maybe that's correct. Maybe that's true, because you get one of the tensions that increasingly comes up in this season and then goes full bore in season 3 is that tension within Will. One of the reasons he's so attracted to Hannibal is that Hannibal sees a kind of truthfulness in him, and it's a truth that Will has been trying to deny and suppress, and buried beneath false construct of personality.
All of our culture, and from the Renaissance onward, has been obsessed with this idea of, the human, the best thing for the individual, and it is always the individual, is to pursue their nature, and to express their nature. And that, of course, that finds itself hugely expressed in the Romantics. You mentioned the Romantics later. I mean, Blake and that lot and so on. It's interesting, isn't it, that this entire sort of corpus of texts, it oscillates back and forth between these 3 great poles, the Gothic, the Renaissance, and the Romantic. And they all have distinct, although interrelated, attitudes towards this very idea, of sort of the individual nature and the pursuit of the full expression of the individual nature. You have, of course, in the Renaissance, particularly in Renaissance drama, the idea of the overreacher, the Marlovian figure who destroys himself through the pursuit of his inner nature and stuff like that. But it's one of those things that our culture, Western culture, modern Western culture, is obsessed with, the idea, and it's usually presented in a sort of saccharine and maudlin way as as an absolute good. You should find find your nature, your truth, your goal, your vocation, however it's phrased, and you should go for that with everything you've got, etc., etc. And yet there is this, there is this ambiguity in that, because the nature of the individual is not an inherent good. We all have inside us, all of us, parts of our nature that are not socially, and that's interesting, because it links back to the whole idea of art as social, which is something that Sakizuke talks about. The Will describes, when Will is trying to understand the muralist, he says something like, I am a dead eye of vision and consciousness. I am fixed and unseeing unless someone else sees me.
Yes.
So it recognizes the idea of the work of art as something Promethean, like the modern Prometheus, Frankenstein creating his monster, etc. But the whole point of that text, of course, that's Gothic and Romantic, capital R. The whole point of that is that it's a social act which is not treated socially. It goes wrong because the monster is not given. He is not allowed to be social. He is that part of modernist society, or modern society, that is that affects the social, and yet is not social, that is not allowed to be social, and that's why it all goes wrong. And that's sort of Shelley's great sort of forecast for the coming modernity.
Of course.
And of course, she's talking, part of what she's talking about is romantic art, capital R, because she was in that milieu with Byron and so on. So you have this whole idea of, Byron is a great example of it. The pursuit of the individual nature to the expense of all else, and yet, of course, that's not an unalloyed good. It can be destructive, it can be hateful and hurtful, and so on and so.
Absolutely.
It's quite interesting.
Byron hurt a lot of people. He wrote some fantastic poetry, and he did some great things, but he also hurt people, including himself, dreadfully. And Mary Shelley saw that. This is very much about the double-edged nature of that, isn't it? That Promethean imperative does have this dark side to it, which is it's hard to find the escape hatch. How do you prize one without embracing the whole thing?
Exactly.
But what is interesting about the difference between Western literature and maybe some Eastern literature is that they're often dealing with the same thing, but the full expression of the individual, with then the warnings that come with it, or the calamities that come with it. And it's apt that and only a few weeks ago, I mean, it's a translation, of course, and we always have to allow for that because I can't read the original Japanese, but I'd reread Mishima's Spring Snow, and of course, but that's coming from the angle of the full expression of individual nature is frowned upon a priori, and then you get the calamity that, because of course, particularly in traditional Japanese hierarchy and structure, it is the suppression of individuality for the good of a higher, or quote unquote, higher ideal. And whereas the individual is quite frowned on as as something to be released or unleashed in the way that a lot of these other pieces that we've been talking about are, even though they come with their own warnings. It's like they're coming at the same thing from two massively different angles, which makes you think, I'd love to see something like this. Obviously, it couldn't be the same, but that something that's got this kind of subject matter. Hannibal, I mean, from a Japanese film company or something. I just wonder which direction it would go in. It'd be so.
It's fascinating. I mean, it is really fascinating, isn't it? One of the things that Hannibal seems to be saying is it's an incredibly transgressive message. It seems to be saying that, you can pursue this notion of identity of the individual self, but it may not necessarily be what society wants or prescribes it to be. And you may not like it when you find the truth of it. I mean, Will doesn't. Will absolutely doesn't. That's the difference between him and Hannibal. Hannibal embraces it. Hannibal embraces whatever imperative comes into his mind and runs with it as an inspiration, as something, as an expression of the divine within the human. Whereas Will is in conflict all the way through. And what Hannibal desperately wants is to deprive him of that conflict. or release him from that conflict. The irony being, of course, if he did that, then maybe quite a lot of what he sees in Will would go away, would dissipate.
Because one of the things that obviously does attract him, and I think it's made explicit in series 1 as well, is the notion of the hyper empathetic person, the
Exactly.
person who has that. Well, I mean that would be absolutely anathema to the way that he operates.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he wouldn't so much as hurt a fly if that were the case. You know?
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of an
come back
inversion.
to that repeated.
But then it's
line.
the yin yang thing, isn't it? It's about the combination of opposites, because he Hannibal in series 3, if I recall correctly, does very much see them as becoming a kind of combined being.
Yeah,
metaphorically.
it gets quite literal at certain points. Yeah.
But you come back to the repeated idea of acts of cruelty require extreme empathy. That's something that the show keeps coming back to.
Yes.
It keeps on emphasizing the idea that, we like to think of empathy as just this positive category. It's not. You need empathy. You need the ability to imagine what it's like to be another person in order to enjoy inflicting suffering on them.
Exactly that. I mean, the popular conception of psychopaths, which is what you get in fiction all the time, which is that they lack empathy, they don't feel as human beings do, is complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. In fact, they probably feel on a very intense level. They would have to, in order to for the act to be so addictive.
Yeah, Sartre wrote about this in his existential phase. He wrote about cruelty and murder and things like that. He wrote about the part of what spurs the cruelty is the desire to escape the accusation in the eye of the victim. Whatever the murderer does, whatever the torturer does, the victim is always able to look at him and see him. If you're, what Sartre maybe is missing there is the idea that itself can be part of the experience for the torturer. And
the greatest expression of that I've ever seen on film, which again, a film I would not want to see again, but that is in Pasolini's Saulo. That is basically what Pasolini's Saulo is about, and it is very, very powerful. I couldn't watch it again,
that's a film I will not watch the first time.
Pretty much didn't get through it the first time. However, because it is a film with that backing it, I mean that is obviously the passionate content that runs through that film. But that, absolutely, Sartre's point there really it just beamed into my head. I was like, absolutely, that film. But that it's funny because
in Sartre we see ourselves when other people see us. It's that line. I think this is also in Sartre. I think it's the idea when somebody catches you doing something like picking your nose or scratching your ass or something like that, you then become aware of yourself in a way that you're normally not, because you are seeing yourself through the eye of the person who is seeing you, and they're really seeing you. They're not seeing the version of you that you project or the performance that they're seeing you, the actual sort of itching, sweating, farting, living piece of meat, that nevertheless is able
takes us right back to the mural. Except that then you'll just the eye becomes the eye of God. That's the aspirational part of it. The all-seeing eye.
And what Hannibal's point is that there's no God in that sense, but there is man. Man can look at man. Man can look out into the heavens and see himself looking back at him, and that is a chink of light, even if it is like this horrifying tableau of murdered bodies. That is still, there is still creation there. There is still consciousness there. There is still it is very difficult for us to say, I embrace the pantheon, the ancient Rome, the Renaissance, all this stuff. I embrace this, and yet I choose to, all the nasty things. I don't embrace that. We can shun we're back to Walter Benjamin, aren't we? All products of culture are records of barbarism. because it is, barbarism is just encoded and impregnated in everything that human beings
and it's also
create.
baked, and therefore baked into our notions of the divine, which Hannibal again talks about explicitly.
Great creator is also the great destructor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, in
Killing
Hannibal's
must feel good to God. He does it all the time. And are we not made in his image? Yeah.
Exactly.
Another one of those borrowed lines that's been recontextualized.
Exactly that. And it's weirdly recontextualized. I think it's in Hassun, isn't it? Because it's when Will is imagining Hannibal sewing the muralist into his own,
and that aggrandizes as well when it becomes a part of your when it can be related purely to one's own sense of ego in the psychological sense, because it's I was saying to our friend James Murphy, I said, I'd been rereading Shira's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, because I haven't read it since I was a teenager. I've read many books on the Third Reich and Nazis and everything, but that was the first one I sort of properly seriously read, because I was
me too. I read my grandfather's copy.
Well, I've read my father's, and because we were doing it at school, it was part of the syllabus in history, and I was fascinated. My dad kind of cottoned on, and he said, "Oh well, this was a reporter who was there at the time, blah blah blah." But in the speeches, one of the things that for all the rich and varied reasons and the historical contingencies and everything, when you're just purely reading about Austria, and you've got these direct quotations, which Schmidt has written down in interpretations and everything, as the interpreter and everything, and it's just him basically going, this what they did to me. What I'm going to take them off the face of the earth because what they did to me. And it's, my God, yes, it is. The barbarism, the everything. It just comes under the sadism of they saw me as nothing. They saw me as this tramp, this down and out, and everything. I'm going to, and it's, you think, my God, for all the complexities around it, that just feels so nakedly simple. And so horrible for it, and we know there's more to it than that, but just in those moments of direct speech captured, where it's just so personal and so vindictive that an entire country and culture, which is his own as well, and obviously that need to be a part of Germany instead, to be and you think, my God, this is so fucking personal, and it's like it's frighteningly, the scale of it, it's like, we've all been done wrong, Adolf. But my God, to the idea of wiping a country off the face of the earth because, or reducing it down.
Funny, I had a similar. I'm still reading the Peter Longerich biography of Heinrich Himmler.
Oh yeah.
And I was reading some of it.
His were really personal, weren't they? It literally was defeated ego, wasn't it?
Oh, the early sections where it talks about him as a young man, it's just, it's sexual insecurity, and it's the fact that people found him annoying because he talked too much, and it's the fact that his brother had a girlfriend that he didn't like. It's and just shitty books that he read. It's nothing. It's nothing. But then you get even further. I'm sort of 4/5 of the way through it now, and I'm at the point where Longerich is now talking about the beginnings of what we now think of as the final solution. The Holocaust as a whole is underway, but I'm at the point where I'm reading about Himmler's role in the setting up of the final solution. And it's obviously, like you were just saying, Elliot, there's loads of stuff going on, there's loads of complexity, there's loads of causes, etc. But a huge part of why this happened is because this one guy, his career ambitions were dependent upon, he was like the head honcho in the Reich for German ethnic matters, okay? And he was trying to extend his sphere of influence further east into the conquered former Soviet territories that the Nazis were taking over, and Poland and Eastern Europe and stuff like that. And he was being blocked from extending his remit eastwards by mainly by Alfred Rosenberg, who was like competing for hegemony in the same sort of policy areas. And a huge part of why he, and as a result, Heydrich under him, they start on the road towards the extermination camps, is because it's a way of extending police actions, which he does have authority over. As the Reichsführer SS, he does have authority over police actions in these areas. So the more he extends the camp system, the more he extends his power into these areas. A huge part of this is about extending his bureaucratic and political influence.
Wow.
That I mean, in a strange sort of way, that almost. I mean, whatever way you turn it, it's grotesque. But that almost feels more grotesque than actually, because at least if it's purely about the hatred towards a group, or then the group are taken into account.
Yeah.
Whereas this, they're just collateral.
This is filth on another level, isn't it? It's filth on another level.
One of the things about him that the Longerich biography keeps coming back to is that, yes, he was anti-Semitic, obviously, but he was anti-Semitic in a kind of a casual, theoretical way. It was anti-Semitism was never a particularly big thing with Himmler. Like it was an absolute, it was a frothing, ferocious obsession for Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
Right. But Himmler was, it was anti-Semitism. Yeah, I agree with that.
It was more pragmatic almost.
Yeah, he wasn't mainly motivated by it. It wasn't the biggest thing for him.
I remember reading, just being sort of really struck about, again, a direct reaction from Hitler during the sort of initial pogroms, where the punishments meted out to, it would have still been brown shirts at that point as well. I mean, the SS was in existence, but doing a lot of the sort of the legwork, where the punishments meted out to Nazis who raped Jewish women because they were fornicating with them. It was like, my God, there's a wrinkle that never would have thought of unless I read it, which was,
of course,
it's like, you can murder them, fine. But what have you done? You're.
It's almost like you've become tainted or something. Yeah,
that's racial defilement.
The racial, and you just think, oh my God, this still has the capacity to surprise me. It's like, wow, yeah.
In the minutiae of it, but then again, you see similar mindsets in Operation Nam. You look at the minutiae that obsesses them, and you're like, yeah, I can kind of understand that now. It's so awful. It's so repulsively petty.
The terrible degradation and humiliation would have been perhaps no. There were caveats and
and little extenuations all the way down and branching out.
I think that's what Jack was saying
so
about
bizarre.
Someone such as Himmler and someone such. I mean, it's all disgusting anti-Semitism, but there's levels within it.
Yeah. There's essentially dogma, isn't there? Just like it's like a dogma. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
Some of them who are just like, well, yeah. I mean, and again, in a sense, it's almost worse because it's like, well, I'll just go along. I don't really believe it, but I'll just go along with that because it gets me a nice position.
It gets me power. It gets me status.
I don't want to piss off the Führer. If
it feeds my ego. Yeah.
In fact, there's a great. I don't know if either of you have or will see, because I will just stop talking. Because it's a great moment in the adaptation of Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle. I don't know if either of you have seen it or intend to see it. It's a very slow burning series. It took me a long time to. It was one of those I sort of persevered with because I love the book so much. When I was reading it, it's like when I was younger. But there is. It's a spoiler, so if you want me to stop, I'll just stop.
I haven't seen it, but I intend to at some point.
You do?
I do, yeah.
All right, well, I will stop right there.
I hear good things.
It pertains to Himmler, and it's a really, really great moment, and I'm not going to spoil it. I'm not even going to minor spoil it, like providing you with a pretext. That gets to that which Jack is just talking about, and it's you think you've done your research here, well done, because it's not in the novel. It's not in the novel, but it's in the adaptation, and it's like, yeah, that's it.
Mhm.
That's it. It's a
Mhm.
very, very well written scene. Yeah, it's a funny show. I mean, it's one of the. I'm sure you've probably experienced it yourselves with books and television and films, where it's the thing that as you're going through it, you're like, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this to myself? And then it's later on, maybe 2 weeks or a month later, you go, God, that was really good, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's
you,
amazing.
you prefer it in retrospect for some for some curious reason.
The biggest case of that for me has always been Moby Dick, because I remember when I read Moby Dick, I was not enjoying it. I was kind of plowing through it, and I was thinking, "Oh God, I could be doing literally anything else."
In that, though, to be fair.
Yeah, but somewhere along the line, it kind of hypnotizes you. You kind of,
it's great
you just,
moments are.
it just envelops you, and you find yourself completely captured.
Yeah.
It's just the enthusiasm of Melville for that world, isn't it?
Yeah.
For that culture. It is just intoxicating. The only real big dip is that middle when it just becomes an index of whaling of the era.
There's a guy I worked with, a theatre producer, who almost, Jack, said exactly word for word what you just did about it's good, and he's ended up doing, I think, something like 3 or 4 different theatrical versions of it where he's adapted it. He said, and it was I almost felt like a bit of an arsehole for saying this, because it was one of those moments where I hadn't seen him for a while and we were talking, and I said, "Oh, what are you up to now, Phil?" And he mentioned Moby Dick. I said, "You're still doing Moby Dick?" And I almost immediately went, "Oh God, you sounded a dick saying that." But he was very good about it. He said, I can't. It won't let me go.
Yeah.
And he reiterated the story. He said, and I can't even say I enjoyed reading it. There were moments where I sort of was, as you said, George, hypnotized or elated or in this kind of extraordinary like fog with it, like almost visceral. He said, but there were I was going, oh God, no. And he said, but it's never let me go. I think he's done, I say, about 3 or 4 adaptations in the 20 years since he read it.
I totally understand. I really do, because I think there is something about Melville's enthusiasm for the subject that just bleeds. It radiates off the page. He loves this world. He loves it so much, and he just wants to talk to you about it. The book has that feeling of somebody you meet down the pub or in a bar who has a specialist subject that they really enjoy and describes it beautifully well.
Yeah. But so it's not quite Melville, but it had that sort of effect on me where I was written, because I didn't watch it with Vicky. She's actually started to watch it separate to me, but I was like, I don't know if I'm going to continue. There were a couple of points I was like nearly on the verge of stopping, particularly earlier on. It's like, the actors are doing really good work, and that everyone seems to be, I don't know, there's just a bit leadenness, a bit, and then, as I say, in retrospect, it's like, oh, okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I always feel that way about the third book of the Gormenghast trilogy, Titus Alone.
Titus Alone. God, that's a weird book.
Isn't it weird? It is. The sad thing is that Mervyn Peake was actually losing his mind in the process of that. He had a degenerative condition. And it's one of
those works where the mental pain of the artist is just scratched onto every page.
You can feel it. You can actually feel his mind degenerating as it's read, and it makes you feel as the reader as though it's happening to you too. It's unbelievable, and I don't ever enjoy reading it while I'm reading it, but after I've read it, I feel some powerful connection to it. It's really beautiful, really sad, and boy, is it hard.
Maybe it's probably because, again, it's another Western thing, but we place enjoyment at the heart of so much, and taste, and taste is the killer of art, of course. And Nathaniel West was that, I think. Because I've been systematically, as I've said to you before, working through films and television series and ripping my physical media to protect it and so on. And I went through a bunch of films recently, and I thought, oh God, all these films are heavy going. And then another voice said, but you'd never get rid of them. I said, no, I wouldn't. And I'll probably go back and rewatch them.
Yeah.
You know, I've got my trash. I've got my absolute trash, which I love, and you know, and the stuff that just allows me to disappear. And then, of course, you've got your stuff that you watch very occasionally, and some of it I was like, am I going to rip this? And then the other voice, yes, you are, because you will watch this again, even though there's another part going, wow, it's heavy, this, and it's bleak, or it's nihilistic, or whatever, you know.
I did a My Life in Horror on Raymond Briggs' When the Wind Blows recently. That's another one. Another one. Every time I watch that, I swear to myself, never again. I am never watching that again. It hurts too much.
I've never seen the film version of that. I had the book. I had the book when I was a kid, and I was fascinated and obsessed with the book for a good long while when I was a kid. But I've never seen the film version.
It hurts. It is one of the most painful things I have ever seen on screen. It hurts so much to watch, but it is compulsive. I come back to it perennially, you know, because I forget how painful it is to watch, and I come back to it, and then it hurts all over again. It's like being traumatized. So it's such a powerful piece of work, beautiful, utterly beautiful. But is it enjoyable? No, not on.
You make it sound like you make it sound like Come and See or something like that.
God, yeah. We instinct, and you know, it doesn't have to be necessarily brutal or you know, painful, but there's. But I think, you know, we've had Have You Been Entertained put so at the heart of our sort of modern way of experiencing things, and then you think, actually, it's not always useful.
No, it's not all the be all and end.
Enjoyment is necessarily useful. In fact, it can be quite the barrier.
Absolutely.
Not, you know, I mean, it is nice to enjoy things too, but you know, it can. I say it can be a barrier because sometimes you need to run up at things, and you think, oh, all I'm thinking about is whether I'm going to be engaged or entertained, because there's enormous. You know, enormous favourites I've got that one of their overriding features is boredom. And you know, I like a lot of Tarkovsky films, and they're boring.
I thought Tarkovsky was about to make an appearance.
Yeah, they're incredible, but then you know, that they're also very often films that it's in the closing moments, or it's a few days later. You go, oh my god, yeah, okay. I know why I go, but there are points also during Stalker or Solaris you're like, whoa, okay, just grip the sides of the chair and keep going.
A lot of the films we've done for Not the Same Log kind of have that feeling about them. You know, they excite emotion that would otherwise be considered negative. I mean, like the Blair Witch Project, for example. It's a wholly negative film.
Boredom's a good emotion sometimes. I mean, it can be oddly useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a weird thing that a lot of television, particularly in the 80s, in the mid to late 80s, started to be about boredom. It's a very strange thing. I became aware of this particularly from classic Doctor Who, which you know I'm a lifelong fan of classic Doctor Who. There's an awful lot of classic Doctor Who from the 80s which is about boredom. It's very strange, like the stories about villains who are bored. Or about places where people are trapped and nothing happens, and people just sit there in nothingness, you know, with no form of escape. It's a repeated thing in 80s Doctor Who. It keeps coming. That, you know, a race of eternal beings who play these ridiculous games of sort of racing games through space with like abducted human beings, because they live forever and they've got no ideas of their own and they're just bored. And the more you look at television from that era, you see it over and over and over again.
Yeah, kind of ennui.
It's the strangest thing.
Yeah, how interesting. I'd like to go deeper into that actually and try and figure out why.
As you say, that story crops up because it crops up with the circus story, of course, as well. Again, you know, these stone idols who are bored.
Yes.
You know, so but that
This-
even
in the-
tawdry circus entertainment is, you know, they're even watching that. They're down to that.
In the Peter Davison era, there's a trilogy which is called called by fans the Black Guardian trilogy, and it's
Oh, that's all
3
boredom, isn't
stories
it?
in a row, which means it's 12 weeks of Doctor Who. Three stories, 4-part stories. So it's 12 weeks of Doctor Who, and the entire thing is about people who are just fucking bored.
In fact,
Just bored to death.
as I remember, the first ones are so bored that the whole thing becomes about the right to die, or becomes about euthanasia.
Want to die? Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
It becomes about euthanasia, and also the series very much without hand-wringing or prevaricating about it comes down on the side of okay, that's fine.
Kill him.
Yeah, that's fine.
Interesting.
Okay, if you have a right to die, and fine. And and the second one is the second one actually is probably as close as Doctor Who has got to Tarkovsky. I always think of Terminus as kind of junior Tarkovsky, really. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
because that's the one where not only is everyone bored, but they're doing it in a really boring way. And I actually rather like that story. But
I love it.
It's got.
I'm sorry, I love all 3 of those stories.
Because I love the fact it's got Peter Benson in it. Because Peter Benson, who's of the Henry VI,
wow.
our Henry VI,
Yes.
in the BBC, and he's got this. I mean, he has the line. He's, I'm so, it's something along those lines. I'm so bored, and he said it's a wonderful little bit of gallows humor. I think he says to one of his mates, because he's been burnt badly. He's got like 3rd-degree burns. He's been in an accident, and he says to his friend, "Am I dead yet?" He goes, "No." He said, "Oh, thank God, I'm actually hoping for something a little better on the other side." And it's just
There's another bit. There's
so
another bit
lovely.
where the same character, the same character whose name is Boar, by the way.
Yeah.
He's actually called Boar, and
Brilliant.
he's got these injuries, and the guy he's talking to says, I'll get some medicine," and he says to him, "It's really not worth the trouble, you know." And the guy rolls his eyes.
Oh, it's so good.
That is really
He made this
fascinating,
for
actually.
kids.
Yeah.
Because like
This was
a lot of
children's television.
Again, it's that thing about
like-
relics.
It's like
of
Beckett, and
modern
it's like
television
Beckett,
of
directed
film.
by Tarkovsky.
Yeah,
But
that's
it's
it.
made for 12-year-olds.
Yeah,
it's
and
funny you should mention Beckett, because a lot of like comedy from the 80s is also based in boredom, isn't it? I mean, Beckett, if you look at, say, like Bottom, for
to the
example, Richie
extent
and
where
Eddie,
they
you know.
ended up doing it on the stage. They both
Yeah,
did
yeah.
a version of Waiting for Godot on
Mhm.
stage. Aid and Rick.
Yeah,
And
well,
it makes
Bottom
perfect
is Waiting for Godot, isn't it?
And it
Effectively,
is.
it is Waiting for Godot, you know.
But I find
Bottom
it
turns into it turns into farce.
the
But
early
the first
stuff
season,
is-
the first season of Bottom is existential horror.
particularly
Yeah.
when it's just them in the flat and they see
Yeah.
no. And they're doing things like, because they're both terrible insomniacs as well,
Mhm.
and they're trying to get through like a whole night, and they're trying to play chess with an incomplete set and things like that. And it's very funny, but it's deeply
No,
depressing at the
This
same
is
time.
something I've been talking to friends of mine about, because everyone who was a kid, where like from
again,
that era,
boredom.
tends to remember. We tend to remember how naughty it was. We tend to remember how gross it was, and the swearing and the physical humor and whatnot. But there is this incredible existential horror in Bottom.
That's the thing is,
The
like I was talking
sadness
about, it's all the way through 80s British television. All of that stuff from the young ones onward, the young
Yeah.
ones, Filthy Rich and Cat Flap, Bottom.
Yeah.
It's all about people that are trapped together and bored to death.
Yeah.
Red Dwarf, the first couple of seasons, are about
Yes.
people that are just
Brilliant.
bored.
Yes.
The young ones has an episode that's called Boring.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the real tragedy about Richard, of course, is he believes in all the structures and all the institutions which he has not benefited from.
Exactly.
I mean,
And which
he's
are
a proper
actively
little Daily
hostile
Mail
to him.
reader. He's he's jingoistic. He's
British shopkeepers,
he's
best in
racist,
the
he's
world.
sexist,
Best in the world.
and it's done nothing for him. I mean, he is at the bottom.
Yeah.
It's like-
That's why Eddie is so fundamentally more an attractive character. It's why people respond to Eddie. It's because he's also at the bottom, but he doesn't care. He doesn't have pretensions.
Well, he finds
knows
ways to go into oblivion. That's why. I mean, whether it's through drink or whether it's through the fact that he's managed to scrape together some kind of connection to the outside world through these sort of two dubious guys he sort of half knows.
Of course, the secret about Eddie is that the thing that allows him to cope is Richie.
Yeah.
It's being with Richie and being better than Richie and having dominance over Richie. That's what allows Eddie to cope.
But allowing Richie to think that he has that.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they very much operate on the kind of nobleman and valet, where Eddie's the valet. In fact, I think he's literally made a valet in one episode.
At one point, yes.
But of course, Eddie's in the know. He knows really what and he'll allow that illusion. It's Jeeves and Wooster. Yeah, he'll allow that illusion to pass because, as with Woodhouse, Jeeves is the one with the brain and the one who is actually.
There's also that really weird gender politics in Bottom as well, where they are effectively a married couple.
Yes.
And to the point whereby the show knows it, the show actively acknowledges it. There
Eddie even takes to referring to Richie as she later on in the show.
Yes, there are episodes. Yes, where he is referred to as Eddie's wife. His wife's not supposed to know.
When one of them actually has to pretend to be the wife, it's Eddie. Eddie is the one that has to actually dress up as a woman when they go to the hotel.
And he goes for it. That's the most interesting thing. He goes for the role completely.
Yeah,
because it would be undignified for Richie. Because Richie's all swallowed up in that kind of idea of dignity and position, and Eddie doesn't give a fuck.
Eddie does quite well, actually. Even looking as he does, with his breasts on the wrong way round and whatnot, and his pipe, he pulls. He gets on.
Extraordinary segue. But this thing about, as you're saying, it's about relics of, particularly of television. Because television exists it's for such different reasons to film and books as well. And as you said, Jack, for 12 weeks, that was kids' telly. And now, it even if there was a will to do it, it couldn't be done.
No,
it couldn't be done. And this is why I'm always like, part of me is willing to give something of the modern Doctor a bit of a break, because even if by some strange happenstance it had people who wanted to do those things, it doesn't, but if it did, they still couldn't do it. It would be an impossibility,
especially now, of course, because it's half owned by Disney now.
Well, yeah, I mean, the idea of a story like
completely
Terminus
enclosed
is just impossible to fathom. It couldn't happen. It couldn't happen.
Doctor Who, as ever, continues to be this wonderful sort of almost laboratory specimen, whereby you can watch the entire process of the way in which
television,
the change of historical eras and the evolution of the global economy has changed British the British culture industries and British popular culture. It's amazing because it's now
long, because it's that thing, because I think you put up a blue sky. What do we call blue sky? Skeets? Is that it? You
believe so? Yes, yeah. I believe they're called skeets.
Yeah, you put up a skeet, Jack, about Bond, which obviously is in a similar position of a piece of pop culture that has run for so long. I don't think it's as successful at doing it as Doctor Who, because Doctor Who, in a sense, is a metaphor for television. The TARDIS is television, but that a piece of pop culture that runs so long, you are obviously, of course, able to measure so much by it. And you'd made the point, and I thought, yeah, I totally agree with that. We said, like, guys, we don't actually need a new Bond. We don't actually.
You could just not make those films.
You could just stop making them.
A very small part of me that wants them to keep being made, for just the same reason that Doctor Who keeps being made. Firstly, it's wildly inappropriate, but I don't mean that in a kind of sniggering schoolboy way. But it's also it's actually a shortcut to see how interesting the relics of its own past are. in that they seem richer and more multifarious and varied than anything that it can do. I mean, by their existence, Doctor Who and James Bond carrying on as they have disproved the idea of the teleological in history, or certainly the idea that we're progressing, that things are getting better and more. I mean, you know, for all the maybe some of the political things with something like James Bond or Doctor Who in the past, which they've not actually ejected. They're still there. They're still
sort of camouflaged
sexist.
them,
They're still, you know, they've been dressed up in a few ways, but it's still fundamentally embedded.
They put that United Colours of Benetton wash over it.
Glossed.
That's all
it's
they've
been
done.
glossed, but it's still
exactly
so. There is this other part of it who said, "No, let them carry on forever."
Well, it's like that wonderful line from the Chronicles of Barchester, isn't it? Slope's final curse upon the bishop and Mrs. Proudy. May you both live forever.
Yeah. And actually, those are the horrors of those things that you mentioned, whether it's Bottom or those 80s Doctor Who's or whatever. It's the idea of just grinding. Oh, it's a line from Doctor Who, isn't it? The grinding engines of the universe.
Grinding engines of eternity or something.
Yeah, the crushing boredom of eternity. It's there. He sort of, it happens to him in one story, doesn't it? He like goes, "Oh shit, I'm bored."
Yeah. It's the kind of thing that comes up
a
in
supportive
vampire
impervious hero,
fiction.
you know, suddenly the impervious hero of this kids adventure series has one episode where he goes, "I can't carry on like this, it's awful, it's boring."
He actually says, I'm quitting, I'm going to go and live in a hole somewhere.
Oh, they could have ended it there.
Oh god, brilliant. Well, I sense there may be like another conversation to be had here at some point. One, you know, a podcast chatting about, I don't know.
Because in a sense, Hannibal himself is bored.
Yeah,
I mean, Hannibal is in this steady state. He is this cultured being. He surrounded himself with all examples of the best of human culture. He is a perfected individual. He has to see a shrink. He is lonely. He is bored.
It's why he lets Will in.
Comes Will.
Yeah, it's why he lets him in. It's why he's so fascinated with
the
him.
Clock starts for Hannibal again because of Will. And that's why it's interesting in these episodes that we've been watching to see Hannibal make mistakes and everything, because suddenly history's working on Hannibal again. It hasn't for so long. He's just been in an eternal state. It's the same thing happens with Dracula. He's fine. It's not the Carpathians. I mean, he's lonely
until Jonathan Harker comes along.
But as soon as Harker comes along, and then he's brought into society, into London society, tellingly on this historical, wrinkle, where it's about everything's about to change. It's the Victorian era. Yeah, I mean, of course, it resonates again and again and again.
It's actually quite consistent across those Gothic novels. Every single one of the protagonists is bored with their condition or is unhappy with their condition, with the way things
Jekyll
are.
Jekyll
and Hyde, obviously. Obviously.
And to an
Victor
extent,
Frankenstein.
Victor Frankenstein. Yeah. I mean, it's like what
they're dissatisfied with their conditions. The conditions of humanity and culture.
And there's something, I think, also in them being all quote unquote noblemen. Because obviously poverty is crushing, and poverty brings its boredoms and its horrors, but life comes at you fast in poverty.
Yeah,
that's not to romanticize it at all, but
there's that wonderful bit in the film Shadow of the Vampire, which is a fictionalized version of the filming of Murnau's Nosferatu, where the conceit is that Max Schreck playing the vampire is an actual vampire, and it's Willem Dafoe in the film. And it's a film that I have mixed feelings about. But there is a wonderful bit where the vampire Schreck is discussing the book Dracula, and he says, "I read that book. It was really sad." And the people he's talking to are like, "What do you mean it's sad?" And he says, "Well, that bit where Dracula has to cook the Englishman's dinner himself. He hasn't got any servants. They've all left him." It's like, yeah, that really gets at something, which is that, Dracula, he's he's this relic of this world that's disappeared. You know, he hasn't got any servants. He has to drive the coach himself. He has to make the dinner himself. Even in the film, the Hammer film, he has to carry Jonathan Harker's bag himself upstairs.
Yeah.
He's got boxes full of gold hoarded, but he hasn't got any servants. The world, you know, he's bored. The world has just left him behind. He just wants to get back into the world.
I haven't actually seen that
the
film
rush
for
and
a
the
long
flow
time,
of it,
but that's part of a, you know, it's just by dint of my age and everything, but of a run of films from around that period, and it's Shadow of the Vampire, Orlando, Mrs. Park and the Vicious Circle, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. Oh, they have such a crackle for me, because I think they were the first films that I went to see not in the kind of mainstream popcorn cinema. And you know, I was a teenager and I was just starting to trying to extend my feelers a bit. And I remember we had this sort of bijou cinema which did these independent films that, you know, none of the big cinemas would touch. And I rewatched Orlando only this week. Again, it's touching on absolutely the things we've just been talking about, but just in a different form.
One of my all-time favorite movies. I love that film so much.
Incredible film.
I remember being a
student,
being like,
and the novel is incredible. Like you're saying, back getting into texts again and doing, because that is an incredible film. An incredible film.
Yeah. But it is, that's a really good shout, actually, because that film is doing something with Virginia Woolf's novel, not entirely dissimilar to what this show is doing with the corpus of the Hannibal tests.
I totally yeah. And
that sort of deconstruction, rearrangements,
and extension as well.
And extension, of
course. That it comes into, well, what was there for our time, but absolutely the deconstruction as well. You know, it's the fascinating. So I mean, it's in the novel, of course, but the way it's done in the film, I mean, it actually would feel more at peace now in some respects. The interesting things they do with gender in that movie, in the casting, and
it's startlingly ahead of its time.
It really is.
One maybe for another discussion, guys. Do you think? Yeah,
it's got
I think that'd be great to do. I'd love to have a chat.
Incredible film. I hadn't seen it about 20
years. Love
to
to talk about that.
It's like,
movie.
Wow. And Vicky had never seen it. So I was like, oh,
wow.
It's here. It's at the back of the shop. So she was wrapped. I mean, it was...
oh, wow.
No, I remember... I'm like 19 years old. I'm in my digs at university, first year of university, and I rented the VHS, and I think I watched it 3 times in a row. I just the minute it finished, I had to put it in and watch it again, and
wow,
God, just a ravishing film.
It is, and I mean, it was quite tragic as well, because while I was watching it, I thought, well, I wonder what's happened to some of the people involved. You know, because obviously you see a bunch of character actors, British characters, and think, well, I know you guys are gone, but I remember you from this, that, and the other. And I was reading about I have to say, rather basic reasons. I thought the actress playing the Russian princess was absolutely gorgeous. I thought, and she died. I mean, but then I sort of read about her life, and I was the most extraordinary. She was actually HIV positive during the film. But her boyfriend was in a band, and it was a bad thing with a needle, unfortunately. Right. And obviously they were in but she survived. I mean, she survived with, considering the time as well. I mean, and obviously she'd been fortunate enough to get the medications as they turned up, and were able to stabilize even for quite advanced stage of being HIV positive. But she had a congenital heart issue as well, and it was actually that she had a real out of left field heart attack. But I've decided I'm going to stop doing this, because the same thing happened last year when I was watching again, a film I hadn't seen in years, but which I loved as a teenager and still love. That was Paper House, and I wanted to know what happened to the two youngsters. And she did the one film, and I think gloriously says, "Well, I did Paper House. What more do I need to do? I've done it." Paper House. And then I read about the boy, and he died like only a few years in sort of similar circumstances to the character he's playing in the. And I thought, so I've now decided I'm not going to. I'm going to stop looking people up because I always find the poor devils their lives have ended in such awful ways, or prematurely, I
always feel sorry for people who come to the original Poltergeist and then go and look up what happened to everyone involved.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah. I mean,
just a litany of tragedy.
I know it's just a bit daft with considering some of the but because. Like any movie, Exorcist has the same. There's a lot of any movie has tragedy around.
Of course, it does. Of course,
how many people are on them? I mean,
because of the amount of people involved, of course it does. It just seems to be peculiar that so many of the main cast and people, the people that people would recognise.
The Cecil B. DeMille dramatization of the 1917 Russian Revolution. More people died in that movie than died in the actual revolution, which was remarkably bloodless. But more people died. Extras were crushed, and
oh my god!
Statistically, more people died in the film than actually died.
Wow.
In the revolution itself.
Well, guys, on that note of trivia, shall we call it a night for this one?
Yeah, sorry, we did go down a few rabbit holes.
No, it's been really good. It's been lovely, actually, and I think it's opened up a couple of doors for later podcasts as well.
Yeah, I mean, Orlando would be. I think we can even actually almost, because of the way that film is made, we can almost squish that into a kind of it's gothic-y.
Oh god, yeah, you don't need excuses. We can talk about whatever on this channel. We can talk about whatever you like, guys, whatever you fancy.
For the Spooktober this year, I guess we must make good on our Mask of the Red Death.
We have to.
Roger Corman
we have to. I mean,
yes, R.I.P. Yeah,
it's got to be done. It's got to be done, doesn't it? I mean, we were toying with the idea anyway, weren't we? So, this just crystallized it.
I've finally seen Jordan Peele's Us after being very late to the party, and I know we were talking about Get Out. So whether they want to do like Get Out and Us as a kind of duo, that's a very
I'd be up for that.
Very interesting. I was shocked how old it was because that's just I'll get around to that. 2019 is that? Hang on.
Yeah. It still feels very new, doesn't it?
Yeah, but that was my first viewing week before last.
Oh wow! Gosh, it's quite late on. Yeah, that's
well, Kit, our dear mutual, Kit, mentioned it, and I went, Us. He was going to watch it. Edit that out because I don't want to mention Scarlett's name on a podcast because I haven't got her consent. So he mentioned, and I went, Us. I was meant to watch Us, and I haven't, but now I've been reminded, so I'll watch Us.
Yeah.
And it was
I'll be up for
very interesting movie. That very interesting. Yeah.
So well up for that one. Right, guys. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to discuss, pimp out?
I'm
generally advertise.
My life's gone crazy, and I've got a stack of it, but it won't be out for ages. So I've got to keep stum about it for a moment. But it's only the usual. It's nothing particularly interesting. It's just my usual work. But if anyone goes on and needs audiobooks in their life, but they've all still got the the gag orders on them.
Okay. So I'll tell you what, throw me, when you can talk about them, when you can advertise them, throw me the links and I'll scatter them about.
Bless you.
No problem.
You don't want to worry about gag orders. They don't mean anything. You can just break them with impunity, apparently.
Well, yes.
Apparently so. Apparently so.
Okay, well, for me, I'm on Blue Sky at Times Carcass. I'm at Eruditorium Press. I'm at Patreon. You can get everything I do in advance of publication for $1 a month. And I do lots of podcasts, less writing than I wanted to get done so far this year, but I'm still chipping away at various things. And the main thing I do is I Don't Speak German, the podcast about the far right that I do with Daniel Harper, which is back after its hiatus, although our production schedule has been a bit slow for one reason or another. But we have just recently put out, for instance, a new bonus episode for patrons, which you can get access to for just $1 on the surprisingly good 1993 presidential political comedy Dave, starring Kevin Kline. And that's me pretty much. At the moment.
Excellent. Links below, guys. Links below, as per usual. As for myself, you can find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Allergy and on its sister channel, Our Lives in Horror. If you go to strangeplaygrounds.com, you'll find links to all of my published work. Or if you go to Amazon and type in George Daniel Lee, you'll find my author page with all of my short story collections and whatnot floating around. Arrow Films, you'll find the Hellraiser UHD and Blu-ray set, the Quartet of Torment. And there's a few other ones now that have used the same press that are like a different format or something. And the aforementioned Kit Power and myself, we feature on the Hellbound disc on the featurette Hell Is What They Wanted, which is an hour and 48-minute chat about Hellraiser and Clive Barker and horror and fiction and media and metaphysics and all the stuff that goes on in these podcasts.
The good stuff.
Effectively. It's good fun. It's good fun. Over at Ginger Nuts of Horror, I'm currently doing the My Life in Horror series of articles. As mentioned in the show, there is one going up. I think there's one up now, actually. I think it's up now, about When the Wind Blows by Raymond Briggs. And I think that's it for me for now. Well, guys, that it's been lovely. It's been lovely getting back on the Hannibal train. It really has.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah,
and again, Sakizuke, fucking incredible episode. My favorite so far.
Honestly, it's one of high points. It's so good. It really is a wonderful episode. Until next time, guys. Bye bye.
So much.
Bye.